This morning we're happy to have Professor Mark Rajkovich speak to us about the constructing climate-related resilience in buildings. Dr. Rajkovich is an associate professor and associate dean of research and creative practice in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Buffalo. His work at UB focuses on the intersection of climate change, social justice, and the built environment. He's a licensed architect, has a PhD in urban and regional planning from the University of Michigan, a master's degree in architecture from the University of Oregon, and a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University, and he's also very smart. Dr. Rajkovich is currently the Building Sector Co-Chair of the New York State Climate and Impacts Assessment, examining how the built environment of the northeastern United States will need to adapt to changing climate. He has also supported professional organizations like the Urban Land Institute, the American Institute of Architects, and the U.S. Green Building Council as they incorporate resilience into their programs. This research has been featured in national news outlets like ABC News, The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg City Lab, and The Atlantic. As an undergraduate student traveling back and forth between Cleveland and Ithaca, Dr. Rajkovich crossed over the Chautauqua Lake Bridge dozens of times, and he and his family have also visited Chautauqua on several occasions. And he's honored to have the opportunity to present his research. Please welcome Dr. Mark Rajkovich, and before that, his family is here. Would you stand up, please, family?
It's Nick.
Is Nick? Nick? Okay. And we also have Maria Novacelia, who wrote the article for the Daily Chautauqua. Maria, stand up. Thank you. Okay. Dr. Nick Rajkovich.
Good morning. Thank you, Bob, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Mark for the invitation to come here today, and for all of you for being here, and also to Maria. I really do appreciate it. It's actually one of the nicest articles that's ever been written about my work, so that was a nice thing to wake up to this morning. I also really appreciate the fact, and I appreciate you applauding my parents and my wife and son who are here. My son is quite shy, so I've promised not to point him out too many times today. He's maybe hiding under a pew as we speak. So this is a tremendous honor for me this morning to have the opportunity to speak with you. As Bob mentioned, when I was going to Cornell, I grew up in Cleveland, and so when I was going to Cornell, I drove across the bridge here a number of times, but also visited friends and family who were here, and really kind of believe in the spirit of the Chautauqua institution and this ongoing education that really reaches much broader communities than just academia. So thanks for bringing me from our ivory tower. I actually work in an ivory tower. We have a tall building that has a white tower. My dean hates it when I call it the ivory tower, but it actually is. This morning, I'm here to share with you a little bit about climate change and to talk about how we can begin to construct climate-related resilience in our buildings. I use this picture to talk about climate change because I think it's a good representation of how climate is impacting where we are right now, which is here in Western New York. This is kind of what climate change is expected to look like in the future. It is heat waves, it is hot days, but it's also real changes in the overall temperature of Lake Erie, which changes precipitation patterns. And as we see changes in the jet stream and things like that, it brings these significant snowfall events. The story behind this was that I moved to Western New York in 2014, and when we had Snowvember, how many of you were here for Snowvember 2014? Or the blizzard that we recently had? Yeah. So folks are lucky if you're not here for these kinds of events, but in Buffalo, where I lived, I woke up that morning and they were screaming on the news that the National Guard was here, that the governor was flying in, that they had every available truck that was out there, and I pulled my window open and there was 4 inches of snow on the ground. And I looked out and I thought, people in Buffalo are supposed to know how to deal with snow. Like, what's the deal? Why are people freaking out about this? I got an email from a student a little later this morning, said, I'm snowed into my house, I can't get out. And I really didn't understand like what he was talking about. There was only 4 inches where I lived. And I said, well, try to make it if you can. And he replied with this picture. And I said, well, you're excused from class, certainly, as long as I can use this picture for all of my future presentations. And it actually was the cover of a book we recently did. But these are, climate change is incredibly local. We're going to have very, very different effects. You might be in the snow belt of Buffalo and see something like this, or be in other portions of Buffalo where you only see 4 inches of snow. And teasing that out and understanding that, I think, is a really challenging thing for science to do, but something that we really have to try to work through. The interest in buildings and how buildings are going to be impacted by climate change, at least in New York State, really came out of Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And so the last time the state of New York, Bob mentioned in his introduction, New York State's currently working on updates to the climate impacts assessment, where we're trying to understand how all different sectors of the economy, agriculture, energy, society, and economy, are going to be impacted by changes in the climate here in the state. But in 2011, New York State completed its last assessment. And one of the things that happened in 2012, actually a few weeks after that assessment came out, was Hurricane Sandy. And it really changed the discussion downstate. New York City is the largest kind of collection of architects actually globally, and began to have conversations about what we needed to do to make buildings more resilient to things like hurricanes. This poor building, right? This has kind of become the poster child in many ways for Hurricane Sandy, but also the kinds of impacts that we can see in buildings. When I've showed this to my undergraduate students, sometimes they've asked me, how did the direct TV dish that's on the roof actually survive the hurricane, right? I don't know the answer to that. But in some ways we do need to try to figure out where are we placing buildings, what is the urban design aspects of that, and what kinds of things do we need to do to make these buildings more resilient, perhaps not to storm surge, which is pretty devastating, but to a myriad of other things that we anticipate happening. So why buildings, right? Most of the conversation around buildings today is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And to slow climate change, that's really where a lot of effort needs to work, right? The built environment is estimated by a lot of different organizations to actually to create about 40% of the annual global carbon dioxide emissions. So energy efficiency, renewable energy, integrating that with the built environment, we still have a long way to go. The great thing for future architects who I change is there's a lot of work potentially for them to do. But the challenging thing is we look at a lot of older buildings in places like Chautauqua, in places where I live in Buffalo, which actually the census estimates has the oldest building stock in the United States, right? They're not very easy buildings to retrofit. Some of my architecture colleagues have talked about we should tear down all of the old buildings, and be building newer buildings that are energy efficient. But that's probably not going to be a way that we achieve our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, nor is it really respectful of the incredible cultural capital that we have in places like the Chautauqua Institution. Other reasons why we really should be talking about buildings, and I'm dismayed, and in the article that Maria mentioned this morning, I don't think we're having enough of a conversation about buildings currently. In New York State alone, we have about 5.2 million buildings, and it's containing, 13.8 billion square feet of space. And if you think about it, we use these buildings for a lot of different purposes. It's the places where we live, it's the places where we work, or it's the places like this where we pray, right? And that means that, continuing to make investments in that is going to be important going forward. It's also a tremendous source of collective wealth within our society. So a very conservative estimate is that about $2.7 trillion just in residential buildings alone in New York State. And I think for many of us, right, our investments in homes and things like that is probably our single biggest investment that we will make in our lives. In addition, we have about $1.7 trillion in commercial buildings, but all of the function that those buildings hold in terms of their economic value, what they're producing for society, is all something that we have to protect going forward. We also spend a tremendous amount of time indoors. So the EPA estimates that we spend about 87% of our time indoors, and this is really where we see environmental exposures to different health hazards like biological contaminants, chemical contaminants, or particulate matter. And being indoors, this is also the primary place where we seek shelter, right? So when we have a tornado in Western New York, I hope no one's running outside, right, to get out of their building, right? You're typically going down into the building. So understanding how buildings need to respond, I think, is a critical issue for the next decade and probably for the next, through the end of this century. So the first part of the talk is thinking about what are some of the different climate hazards that buildings need to think about resisting. One of the ones that comes up frequently in the news and is frequently talked about, though perhaps less of a hazard here, is sea level rise. And through this portion of the presentation, I'm going to show a number of different images. These maps come actually from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and this is an estimation of risk in the different counties of the United States to these different types of hazards. What I will point out as I start to talk about these, or what I want to point out, is that this is based on historical data. This is based on the last 30 years of data, typically. And if you've ever talked to a financial advisor, right, the disclaimer that they always have is past performance does not guarantee future results, right? So as we look at some of these different things, there is a real concern that many of these hazards are actually accelerating and may actually be worse than what current estimates are. But for sea level rise, although it might not be something that's going to directly impact a place like Chautauqua, it's certainly something that has the potential to be devastating to the economic sector of New York State. When you look at New York City and all of the banking and finance that's located within a few feet of sea level, relocating those structures or building anew to push back the sea is going to be a significant challenge. Current estimates are that sea level rise could be as high as 6 feet by the 2080s, right? And 6 foot change in a place like New York City is going to require wholesale kind of re-engineering of systems. And one of the great concerns that New York State has is that people may choose to move those industries out of the state. The taxes from places like New York City benefit Western New York greatly. But it's not just places that are immediately along the coast. So the capital of New York State in Albany is actually on a tidal, in a tidal area. And so that sea level rise is actually expected to go all the way up to the Troy Dam, which is just outside the state capital. So how we plan for this, how we design for this, is going to be a significant issue going forward. Another big hazard that we're talking about, I don't have a map for this for all of the different types of pests. Can anybody identify this one? Any entomologists? The ash borer, that's right. I put this one in the lecture because it's the least kind of scary one to put on. It's actually kind of a beautiful little insect. I used to put, things like termites or other things in the past, and people get up and walk out of my lectures. So, but insects like the emerald ash borer, while they're not directly impacting the building itself, these are weakening trees and structures that during storms, and this is something that FEMA talks about quite a bit, does a significant amount of damage to buildings, right? Loss of ash trees in cities also, those trees are not replaced, and so it drives things like the urban heat island effect, which makes our cities hotter. Other types of insects, like termites, we've been typically pretty blessed in New York State to not have them move very far north because of deep freeze cycles that have happened in the wintertime. But there's some evidence that the termites are moving north from Pennsylvania, and 90% of our buildings in New York State are wood frame buildings, right? So protecting buildings from those types of hazards is going to be progressively a tougher challenge in the future. When we talk about hazards related to climate, though, most of the time we're thinking about extreme weather events, right? We're talking about the heat waves or the cold snaps or the convective storms that are impacting communities. These are the things you see on TV, right? These are the damaged buildings, that make the national news cycle. How do we know that climate change and extreme weather are linked? There's a type of science that's called attribution science. There's actually a great article in the New York Times that was published yesterday, if you get the New York Times, that explains attribution science and how we know things like the heat wave that's been happening in the Southwest can be linked to climate change. Attribution science is a relatively new field. It's actually attributed to an article that came out in 2004. But since that time, in the last 19 years, we've had progressively more data that has been collected and is pointing in the direction of many of the types of extreme weather we see being attributed to climate. But I don't want to get up here. I think it would be dishonest of me to say that every single type of weather right now is linked to climate strongly with the science. We have different levels of confidence. The confidence is on the left axis here from an article from linking extreme weather to climate change. And we also have different levels of understanding about the impacts, right? Where we do have higher confidence is in things like extreme heat and extreme cold. And where we have less confidence is things like extreme storms, severe convective storms, cyclones and hurricanes, or things like drought. And part of the reason why we have less data for these, we don't have a long record to make those links, but also because many things like drought can actually be a combination of a lot of different factors. But I will say, I'm an architect and urban planner, so I try to translate and understand this information for buildings. The physical scientists I do work with are all extremely concerned and believe that the science is there and that it's catching up and showing that each one of these hazards is moving in a direction that's not positive for the built environment. So I'm going to go through a couple of additional maps to talk about some of the other hazards, right? And I'm going to kind of move from our highest level of confidence and our highest level of understanding to a lower level of confidence and understanding. And again, each one of these maps are from FEMA. So cold waves, cold snaps. How many of you stay here in the wintertime in Western New York? It gets cold for the rest of you. It's lovely, it's not as bad. My wife and I did move to Buffalo, New York when we had the coldest January and February ever in Buffalo's recorded history. That was in 2014, 2015. Part of the reason why we get these cold waves and cold snaps, believe it or not, in mid-latitude climates like where we live, is because of loss of Arctic sea ice and changes in the jet stream. And so people have heard the term, Arctic oscillations or things like that on the news, and they talk about the jet stream dropping down, right? These Arctic freeze, Arctic blasts, right? And that really is because, as you see with a change, it used to be that the polar vortex, which is up at the North Pole, would be locked more onto that sea ice. But as it doesn't freeze as much, it's able to wobble quite a bit more and send these cold blasts of air down to places where we live, right? This is expected to potentially increase in the future, right? Because as we have less and less sea ice to keep it locked up, those patterns change. And when that intersects with a warmer lake, like Lake Erie, right, that's when we get these kinds of extreme snow events in places like Buffalo, which are directly downstream of the lake. It's not expected that we're going to have deep, deep freezes long into this century, right? There's a general warming trend that's expected to happen. Those heavy snows are already turning into rain, right? But there are some real concerns about things like freezing rain coming out of these changes in the temperature, which can actually be even more devastating. In a place like Buffalo, we had the October surprise storm, which actually put people out of power for several days in a row, but also kind of decimated the trees that haven't really recovered in the city. Heat waves, and if you haven't figured it out, right, we're in the little red box. So looking okay so far compared to heat waves. The current heat wave that we have in a place like Phoenix, these are expected to increase in the future. Part of what is driving the heat wave right now in the Southwest are things like El Nino and warm Pacific temperatures, and again, changes in the jet stream patterns. It doesn't mean that they haven't had heat waves in the past. In fact, the record that was just broken was from the 70s, and I believe the one that was before that was from the 1930s. But if you think about basic statistics, if there's a trend line that's going up, you're going to have dips below that line and things that go above that line. And if that line is constantly moving up, the chance of having more and more of these heat events in the future is going to happen. It's going to happen. Why do heat waves matter? Heat waves kill more people every year in the United States than all types of natural hazards combined. When you take every single thing that you see on the news and you look at heat waves outpace all of those other things. Why we don't see more coverage of that, right, is heat waves don't make for good news, right? There's not much that you can show on the TV when it's hot outside, right? Already you've seen on the news cycle, we've lost a lot of the coverage of what's happening in the Southwest as it's moved on to other types of stories. But in terms of what this can do to our population, people who do have to work outside in the future, right? People who don't have air conditioning in their homes. So only about half of homes, for instance, in Buffalo have access to air conditioning, right? This has the real potential to cause problems in the future. And also as we age, we become more susceptible to high temperatures. And as we take different types of medications and things like that, we may not actually realize that we're overheating in situations, which can lead to a lot of increased morbidity and mortality. Heat also damages buildings, right? It causes roofing systems to fail and can cause materials in the wall to separate, right? And over time, it can also cause mechanical equipment to fail, like air conditioning systems, when they're pushed to the brink. Like many of the stories that are coming out of Phoenix right now are about air conditioning people who are going building to building and working like 20-hour shifts every day, right? It pushes all of those different systems and the grid to its brink. So we're concerned about heat, not only for its direct impacts on people, but also what it can start to do to buildings. Drought, right? Map's still looking pretty good for Western New York and Cleveland. I got Cleveland in the corner. How does drought begin to impact buildings? Well, this is something where we have a little bit less confidence than the heat and the cold. We have a more of a medium confidence and medium understanding right now of attribution because there are a lot of different factors. Drought itself is probably not going to impact buildings as much, except for as we draw water out of aquifers, right, and you begin to see subsidence or changes in the soil. Or in cases of prolonged drought, it can actually begin to do damage to buildings as the soil begins to pull away from structures. And we've seen this in places in extreme cases like Fresno, California in the Central Valley, where they've seen some buildings that have actually dropped as much as 2 feet because of drawing of water out of the aquifers in the soil. What happens when a building drops by 2 feet? That doesn't mean that the sidewalk drops 2 feet, right? It's the heaviest object. So suddenly, your sidewalk is meeting the door about 2 feet up. Right? So working through that, and in addition, it can do a tremendous amount of damage to the structure of the building. So working through this, understanding how we need to support buildings or support existing buildings is certainly going to be a challenge in that situation. Riverine flooding, again, this is something where we have a medium confidence and a medium understanding of attribution. Riverine flooding is really one of the most costly disasters in the United States, and other than Hurricane Sandy, has been the most costly disasters that have happened over time in New York State. Every single one of New York's 62 counties experience flooding on almost an annual basis, right? And so not building buildings in floodplains is one way to begin to deal with this, but how we begin to retrofit structures, perhaps moving buildings, perhaps taking buildings down and moving people out of floodplains, or doing other things like dry flood proofing or wet flood proofing the basements is going to be incredibly important going forward. Part of my own reason I got interested in this subject is I actually almost this is probably news to my parents, but I almost died in a flood in Binghamton. Sorry, Mom and Dad, that you're hearing this today for the first time. I drove across a bridge that was on, I think it was 81, and the culvert that was underneath the bridge actually washed out about 5 minutes after I drove over the bridge, and it killed several truck drivers who actually drove into the empty hole on the freeway. Sorry, Mom. Right? But these types of systems, culverts and things like that under roads have all been sized for historical rainfall events and historical, precipitation that we receive on an annual basis. And so resizing that and thinking through how we have to redesign these systems is really important. We just worked with, at the University of Buffalo, Niagara County, to update some of their hazard planning. And one of the biggest things that almost every single city identified in Niagara County was that they wanted to upsize the different culverts because they were seeing more and more that things were washing out. Hurricanes, I talked a little bit about Hurricane Sandy that came ashore. Again, we're not expecting to see hurricanes coming up to western New York at any time in the future. But as they begin to strengthen because of warmer water that we see in the Gulf of Mexico and we see in the Atlantic, they can become progressively stronger. I don't know if you followed the news, but there was also an article in the New York Times yesterday that the waters off of Key West in the Gulf of Mexico at a buoy actually hit 100 degrees yesterday, right? So if we do have any one of the tropical storms, and a lack of wind shear coming across the Gulf of Mexico, that's an incredible amount of heat energy that can be drawn into a hurricane. That's 12 degrees above normal, right? The normal range for Key West at this time of year, according to the news article, is between 73 and about 88 degrees. So to be 12 degrees above normal certainly is something that we should be concerned about. I'm not a marine biologist, but folks that I have talked to in marine biology and who look at corals are also really worried about what this means for marine life and the health of those ecosystems. Wildfires. It used to be in Western New York that we used to say, well, we're doing pretty well. We don't have any wildfires until this year, right? When we had a significant amount of wildfire smoke that was driving people indoors, right? And depending on the time of year, we've had smoke now, that's caused my son to have to play indoors, either coming from Quebec, right, or coming from the western portions of the United States. We're still expecting to see more wildfire damage happening in these different locations. One of the things that has been talked about in terms of the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment is we have not had significant fires in the last 100 years in the Adirondacks or in the Catskills, really because we've not had droughts and the kind of conditions to make that happen. But a big concern is that we could see more of that in the future, especially with changes in precipitation patterns. And this is something that has lower confidence and a lower understanding of attribution, not because the science isn't there, but just because it's harder to link what caused each individual wildfire to a specific instance of a warming climate. Convective storms. So this is something that really impacts most of the United States, though strangely, there's a couple little areas in the far desert Southwest, and I guess that's probably just not wet enough to have convective storms happening in those locations, right? This is something that produces tornadoes, produces, other strong straight line winds. This has been something that the general trend that's being discussed in the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment is that things like tornadoes are moving further north and to the east. And so places like Western New York may potentially be moving into more tornadic activity in the future. It's not really something that you can perhaps design a building for, except to give people places to seek shelter within buildings. But it is, potentially a challenge and something that's going to cause damage. So question I get a lot of times, there's nothing on the screen, don't panic. Question I get asked a lot of times, Zach, it's okay. He's running down here. Oh, I'll put the slide. Oh, okay. I wasn't trying to panic him, I swear. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, so we have great buildings in the United States. We build our buildings now to, codes and standards that really are world leading. Do we really need to be worried about these issues going forward in the future? And I would say in many cases for new buildings, we have less concern because we are responding to some of these changes, though many of the codes and standards are still looking at retrospective data the last 30 years rather than projecting what's going to happen going forward. But in places all over the United States, we have things like the International Building Code, the International Fire Code. New York State actually has modified both of those codes to make them stronger than what a lot of other states do. We have things like the International Green Construction Code, which are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's been adopted in many states. And we're also starting to see things like zoning codes, which are starting to take into account some of the different ways we need to plan our cities. But just because we have codes doesn't mean that we have adoption of those codes. and equally across the United States. And so what this map starts to show is though every state has adopted the International Building Code to a certain extent, they haven't necessarily updated it in 5 or more years. And in addition, one of the challenging things that happens locally is that code officials may not be up to speed or actually know how to enforce all of the different provisions of the code. And that's because in many rural locations, like when we were working in Niagara County, there was one gentleman who actually worked with 10 of the municipalities to do all of their code reviews and to do all of their building inspections, right? So that person is spread actually pretty thin in terms of what they're doing day to day. So how we incorporate some of these ideas into the codes going forward, I think is going to be a progressive process, right? There are many states that are starting to think about it. And we were really excited to actually have the opportunity to work with NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, to actually think about what strategies could start to be incorporated into codes in the future, and to develop a strategies document that gave architects and engineers some guidance as to how to think through some of these different strategies. Now, I lecture architecture students usually at about 8 or 9 in the morning. If I go through all 26 of these different strategies, I will guarantee that every person will be asleep in this room, especially with it being a little bit warm today. But many of the things that are in here are tried and true techniques. One of my favorite ones that's talked about in here are things to have more buildings be naturally ventilated so that we're not using energy on the days like today. It's warm in here, but it's doable, right? On those kinds of days, we're not emitting greenhouse gas emissions. But in the event of having a power outage, those buildings are still able to function to a certain extent. If you're interested in reading about all of these different strategies, all 26 that we pulled together, they're available at the website that's on the screen, and I think this is all being recorded, so you can come back to get that link. But what this document also tried to do was to take and so identify a strategy itself, what the name of it was, what its intent was for New York State, to show where in the state it's more relevant than other portions of the state, to identify what hazards, like in this case, for windows, hurricanes, convective storms, and high heat, in other types of strategies that were related to it, to give folks a brief introduction to what the topic is, but then to write in language, and this was actually really hard to do, 1 to 2 paragraphs for the different folks who are involved in design and operation of buildings to understand how this affects what they do. So for owners and operators, there was a certain amount of guidance. For policymakers and planners who are thinking about trying to put this in a code, there were 1 to 2 paragraphs. And then last, architects and engineers about how they pull that information in. And within the document, there were lots of links, and these links pushed people to reputable government documents or peer-reviewed literature so that they could understand and defend these things as they were trying to pull them into a project. One of the other things it did was push people to something called the New York State, this is not easy to say, it's going to take me a second, New York State Climate Change Science Clearinghouse. Yeah, try saying that 10 times fast, right? But to find the additional information they needed in the data, also to begin to back up some of these different decisions. So if you're interested in this and you want to look at it more, it's a free document that's available online. We've seen a lot of people start to download this and start to use it to actually have conversations as part of project teams. So that's been something that's been very rewarding. But how do we make those changes to buildings? Well, we're not going to put all of these different strategies in at the same time, right? We have to think through how we do this work over time. And part of the reason why we do that is different parts of the building last for different lengths of time. When you design a building, how you put it on the site, what kind of foundation you build, and the walls and floors are typically something that doesn't change. That's where we need to make sure that we're really getting things right, because for a building that's going to last 50 to 100 years, right, that's still going to be with the building in 2080, in 2100, right, in 2120. Other aspects of the building, things like the envelope, which is the outside of the building, the insulation, the facade, ducts, piping, things like that, we're probably going to go through cycles of replacement. So if we don't get that quite right, just through natural replacement over time, we perhaps can respond to new technologies and pull that in. And for other things that are going to go through multiple cycles of replacement over time, right, we don't necessarily have to worry as much about that because we're going to change the carpeting potentially 10 times, between now and 2080. And so hopefully getting that stuff right, we'll be able to modify over time. So I tell people this so they don't panic, because if you do look at this, it may be kind of overwhelming. So the other two parts of my presentation, and they'll go through in a little bit less detail than I just did, are people actually going to begin to relocate to where we live here in the Great Lakes region to escape climate change? And just going through some of the quick data about climate change, so this is from the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment. We've seen about a 2-degree temperature increase over time. The number of days that we've had over 90 has stayed pretty constant, although we're expecting to see between 14 and 19 days by the end of this, by mid-century. Precipitation has actually gone up quite a bit, and that really is because with a warming climate and a big body of water near us, it's able to hold more moisture. I think one of the really important things, and goes back to my first image, is that the fall precipitation, which is defined as October, November, December, has actually gone up by 33%, right? And those are those significant kind of rain events that happen in October, or the significant snowfalls that we're seeing in November and December. Heating degree days have increased, so it's getting warmer. We have less need for heating in our buildings, which is a good thing. But we have also seen cooling degree days increase. And over time, there's probably going to be an increased need for air conditioning or other types of cooling in places like Chautauqua, in places like Buffalo. But because the other maps don't show tremendous damage happening, and because relative to the rest of the country, the changes here are more mild, a lot of people have started to plan and think about how we're going to have more climate migrants actually coming to this region. They use the data from the same maps to show that in the counties of Western New York, it's actually considered to be lower risk and lower kind of social vulnerable indices, right? And there's a lot of discussion about this happening. The city, the mayor of the city of Buffalo has actually declared that Buffalo is going to be a climate refuge in the future. But I would say that we need to pump the brakes and think about what this means. We still are really dependent on getting much of our food from other portions of the United States. So until we actually start to understand the risks to global and national supply chains, we can't declare ourselves out of the wood. I think also in places like Buffalo, where we have significant segregation in communities of color that have experienced decades of disinvestment, we need to really think about what that means to be a climate refuge, right? And in Buffalo, that went through redlining for a significant period of time. Redlining is basically where the banks would not write loans to certain communities, right? That has resulted in significant segregation. Most of those neighborhoods that are significantly segregated tend to have much higher risk over time. In fact, most of the deaths that we saw in Buffalo during the blizzard were on the east side of Buffalo. 2/3 of the deaths were in African-American communities on the east side of Buffalo. So if we want to make our whole communities more resilient, we need to take that into account. And this isn't something, I want to point out, that happened in the past. So in fact, one bank in 2015 that I won't mention was accused and actually had to settle with New York State about continuing to redline. And recently another bank has been accused of that and is undergoing litigation for it. So these are things that we really have to think through if we want to make our communities more resilient, if we want to accept migrants from other regions. How do we protect folks who are here, and how are we doing this in a way where we're not having to direct resources to those most vulnerable communities by making them more resilient as well? And I will say that this is not just a wish for more equality. The data shows that redline communities in the past have much higher flooding-related risk. So in a place like New York City, the risk, the share of risk at homes of flooding is higher than it was in communities that were not redlined. And this extends for other things like heat waves and all sorts of other environmental hazards. So working together and figuring those things out now is important for a future climate space. So how do we collectively seek refuge? How do we work together to address climate change? One of the things that I'm most proud of and most excited about is working with an organization in Buffalo called Push Buffalo, which stands for People United for Sustainable Housing. They have adopted an idea about a regenerative economy, and it's called the Just Transition, which is really moving from an extractive fossil fuel-based society to something where we're actually trying to work together and rebuild wealth within our communities and make sure that everybody is participating in a transition to a lower carbon future. This is a diagram that they often show from the Movement Generation Institute. One of the great things about PUSH, though, is they're a force to be reckoned with in New York State, and they actually got this to be put into New York State legislation as part of something called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And so the idea of a just transition, about not leaving people behind as we combat climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is now New York State law. And 40% of the resources that New York State is pushing towards addressing the climate crisis is supposed to go to communities of color. PUSH has done a lot of projects. They're not just talking about it. They've done projects that have actually made a real impact on the community. They were actually able to acquire an abandoned school from the Buffalo School District to turn it into their headquarters. And rather than turning that into apartments that would be at or above market rate, they actually created an affordable living community for seniors that's above a whole floor of spaces for, they have a theater company, they have their own offices, they have spaces for children who are at risk, right? And so taking these older buildings and thinking through creative adaptive reuse is doing something to, again, build wealth in the community. I've been fortunate enough to have some of my students be involved in working with PUSH, and so this was from a recent field trip. Our students have actually been working to help them with different design work, but also to help them with doing some of the planning and outreach to communities. And I think through that, we're really having the opportunity to build a generation of citizen architects who not only understand how buildings go together, but also what this means for the communities that are impacted by climate change. They're learning skills in our school about how to redesign buildings. So one of the current projects that we're working on is actually the redevelopment of 5 houses that are vacant into houses that meet the passive house standard. The passive house standard is really one of the most aggressive energy efficiency standards worldwide. Imagine in a place like Buffalo that if you made a pot of spaghetti, right, you probably wouldn't need any heat to keep your house warm in the winter. And I'm really not exaggerating, right? Something as small as basically the heat that comes out of a hairdryer can be enough to heat an entire home. Right? These are the kinds of things that hit the targets that scientists are talking about in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. But to do that, it's really challenging, right? You're talking about walls that behave very differently than walls in traditional buildings. And so our students are learning the skills to do the energy modeling and other work to make that happen. They're also beginning to build demonstrations. So this is actually a giant mock-up that the students did about what these walls start to look like for buildings in Buffalo. What they didn't really think through was how heavy this actually would be. So this actually took our entire studio of about 12 people to move this. When we gave it to PUSH, and it will be PUSH's forever because we literally can't bring it back to the school. But these kinds of demonstrations are great for showing the community about what a just transition might mean with their homes, but also to get those conversations with architects and engineers and contractors because we're talking about significant shifts. And the thing that I'm really proud about is these students are really passionate about this subject. They are incredibly engaged when they work with PUSH. I don't have to cajole them into doing anything. They're usually their own worst critics. And that's the best thing you can ask for in students, that they want to really do right by the community to not only impact the climate, right, but also to make sure that we're doing the right thing in communities of color or other disadvantaged communities. So this is the thing that I'm the most passionate about in training the next generation. And I'm really hopeful that, as I get older and as I get into the mid-century, that these are the ones who are kind of taking the reins. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I really appreciate it.
You don't get to sit down. You're not done. Thank you, Nick. For people with questions, please come to the mic here so that we can hear and record your questions as well as the answers. This talk will be recorded, and is there any way we can get the first slide that shows you our website where this recording? Can you get to the actual, okay. So we expect to have this talk edited and recorded, and you can go to our website here, chautauquascience.com, to find that, along with our other lectures this year. I'd also like to ask Mark Wensler to come up to make an announcement, and ask any people with questions to come up to the mic.
Hi, everyone. Mark Wensler, the director of the Chautauqua Climate Change Initiative. For those interested in continuing the conversation about climate change in our region, we have a great program this afternoon at 1:30 at Smith Wilkes, where we have a number of local and regional manufacturers and job training centers having a conversation about how to reimagine our region as a center for clean technology and clean technology jobs. So hope you can join us there.
Quite the lineup. I'm a little intimidated, but normally my students just like go to sleep or are trying to sneak out the back. So
there's a connection between livability and sustainability.
Yeah.
It's not so much physical, it's more about social and sense of place. And when you think about a building, you have some of the best buildings here that have porches on them. We stopped building porches and started going inside and stopped participating in the outside life. And that's part of sustainability, right?
I agree.
And then you get the Department of Transportation building roads to support more automobile traffic, creating turning lanes and doing all other kinds of aggressive actions, or what we might even call killer intersections, which then keep people in their homes or away from the outside space. So how do you put the two together? I've never seen them together in a way where it becomes a more holistic future that we're all looking for, and that actually normal people can actually be part of that, because you're in the technical side of that. It's very hard for someone like me that can barely put a nail in a house to do anything.
Yeah. That's a great and incredibly tough question. Joe Schilling is presenting later today, right? No? Or okay. Well, there are a number of different organizations like the Congress for New Urbanism, the Urban Land Institute, that are trying to do exactly that kind of work, which is bringing together livability of our communities with some of the technical aspects of sustainability. And there are a lot of people who have done great theoretical work on that and actually try to put it into practice. Actually, some of the work we did and the way we structured that document is based on some of the work by Christopher Alexander, who was a architect and educator at the University of California, Berkeley, who tried to identify exactly one of the things he talks about is the 6-foot porch is being the right depth for a porch for people to walk past it and make connections to the street. Okay, 12, I mean, that's a nice porch too, but I'm just giving you an example. There are many strategies in this document, so. But his ideas about linking up these different strategies in a way to get more holistic things working at the community scale, working at the building scale, working at the regional scale. And I think getting that alignment among all of the different professions doing that work is one of the most significant challenges. It's part of the reason why when we structured our document, we were trying to talk to different audiences to hopefully get a dialogue happening together. And I think it also happens through these kinds of events, frankly, and through conferences and stuff like that, where people share and have those conversations. But it's gonna take time. And in many cases, we're trying to repair, like in Buffalo, taking down things like the Skyway or putting back, neighborhood streets so that we repair some of the damages that we've done in the past. So I agree with you. Yeah.
All right, I'll try to make this quick.
Okay.
I know that I've been reading about issues such as in Florida where there aren't even insurance companies that will insure properties.
Yep.
Are there places where we should no longer be living in the United States?
Wow, no one pulls punches here for the questions. So I think that I will say that I believe that there are probably places that will be much harder to live in the future. And I think part of the early evidence we see of that is like State Farm recently pulled out of the state of California. They're not writing new policies. There have been many big insurers in Florida that are no longer underwriting insurance. whether or not the federal government is going to step in on flood insurance and other kinds of things to underwrite it, I think is still a big question. Because if you're a congressman from a district that's gonna start to lose people, that's a really tough political conversation. But I definitely think there are going to be places, and we're going to see migrations that are happening. I can't, nor do I want to predict winners and losers, because I think that's a really fraught political conversation. Yeah.
Hi, I was here a few minutes after you started, so my first question is, what is your name?
I'm Nick. I didn't put it on there. I'm Nick Rajkovich.
Hi, Nick.
Yep.
My name is Rebecca. This is my first visit to Chautauqua. I'm from Austin, Texas, and I run a technology incubator called the Austin Technology Incubator, and it has a huge sustainability focus in the companies that are in the incubator. I would like to know how to reach out and collaborate with you, because one of the companies we just graduated is a 3D printing house
Oh, cool.
company. That because it uses cement as the material, the buildings are by definition more resilient. We have room in the incubator for some more companies, and I like to look for big problems that need solving.
Sure.
So I assume you probably know about one or two gaps that you'd love to fill to get maybe to that passive house for everyone situation.
Yep.
Don't know, but I'd love to figure out how to.
That would be great.
collaborate with
And maybe
you
we can
better.
chat afterwards, so I can give you my card. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I suppose I should admit that during the day I work for the property casualty insurance industry, and the answer to the question that was asked is it's all about risk and risk-based pricing. We can pretty much insure anything if we're allowed to get the price to reflect the risk. And the states that have had difficulties, it's because they've not permitted that. Now, let me go to a more fundamental question, because I'm also a local government official.
Sure.
What would you say to a local government about how they integrate the individual building elements which you've talked about with the community elements, for example, stormwater infrastructure, maintaining more of the stormwater on the property as opposed to overloading the infrastructure? So what do you recommend as sort of a holistic approach, integrating what you've said today on individual buildings with regard to communities, and then asking the question of local government officials, is it ultimately better to simply acquire the properties that are in the floodplain rather than to have society pay repetitive losses? So I think it relates to the original question is, what do you suggest about integrating what you've so well presented today with the other factors regarding resilience and sustainability? Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges. I mean, in the past, we have really treated buildings as individual objects within a landscape, and we haven't thought about them as part of a larger system. And I think what we're starting to see is through more advanced modeling, to understand stormwater flows, to understand energy flows, we can start to look at how buildings interact and work with each other. Some of the great work that's happening right now in New York State is specifically around energy and understanding impacts on the grid. And so we can take data from individual meters, sometimes it's metered as much as 5 times every 5 seconds, to understand how the buildings are performing relative to weather and things like that, and begin to design and think through new things like substations and transmission and distribution to not just keep sizing things for the worst day where we might have significant air conditioning loads, but to think about how you may actually stage use of air conditioning or do things like cooling in the off parts of the day to drive those loads at different, and shape the loads. I think that also extends to things like stormwater. So in some municipalities, for instance, when I practiced in Hawaii, you weren't allowed to let any stormwater off of your property. Everything had to be dealt with on site. And so that really was forcing people to put bioswales in, to do things like cisterns and things like that to capture it, and to not just send it into the storm sewerage system. But that's a really challenging thing to do. When the city of Cleveland, for instance, passed a stormwater fee on all of the people in Cuyahoga County, that actually was something that went to like the Ohio Supreme Court and was tested, in that process, because, nobody likes having oversight necessarily of individual properties. That can be a really challenging thing to do. But I think we're going to have to do that. I think we're going to have those different kinds of conversations. And it's going to vary county to county depending on the different types of laws that are in place, and frankly, state to state. Some states are home rule states, some states are Dillon rule states, and all of those things really will impact how we carry these ideas out. But that's a great question.
Thank you for an excellent and very clear presentation. I have a general question about climate change. We heard earlier this week from one of the speakers that 80% of climate change is due to fossil fuels. We've seen different figures. You mentioned 40% of CO2 emissions, the 40% figure. We've seen other figures from, livestock flatulence and a variety of other contributors. What is your assessment as to the different, the percentage contribution to climate change from fossil fuel industry and other sources?
I don't know the exact breakdown of, cows and livestock and things like that versus the fossil fuel industry, but I know a lot of the direct carbon dioxide emissions are certainly attributed to extraction and use of petroleum. There are other, there's 6 different greenhouse gases that are typically put into the basket of gases. So there are other things like sulfur hexafluoride, which are really significant contributors, but that's something that's really coming from like the electric power industry and using that to isolate conductors that are in things like power plants and things like that. But I don't, right now off the top of my head, I don't know the exact number.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I am a homeowner, and we have had solar panels since 2005, and we have tried to keep up with all of the various suggestions that people make with insulation and whatever. My concern, and I don't know if you know how to help this situation, but it just seems to me that living in the economic society that we do, our power companies that control my grid are trying to maximize whatever they can get out of it. And as the length of the time that we have owned our panels, prices have gone up and up and up and up and up. And I think that as we're talking about the necessity of getting prepared, we also have to talk about the necessity of making it affordable and not having prices. I mean, at this point, I'm retired. I don't, as their prices go up, my ability to pay goes down. And I know that there's been back and forth, and we get in touch with our representatives in the state legislature, say, please help us. But I think when we're making a big plan, the big plan has to incorporate how are we going to pay for it?
Sure.
We the people.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's definitely a huge concern. I mean, we've seen as utilities deregulate in different ways in different states, sometimes it's worked really well, and in other cases it's actually significantly increased rates, especially to lower income communities. There are some innovative models. So in California, for instance, with the investor-owned utilities, they actually incentivized energy efficiency with the utilities. And so the utilities actually received a lot of money, if they were able to hit deep energy efficiency targets. And that's one state, that it actually, there's a curve that shows kind of per capita energy usage over time. In California, it stayed flat and actually come down quite a bit over that time period. So I think there's a lot of people who are really thinking about utility regulation and what that means. Mm-hmm. There's also some innovative work that's starting to happen around just reforming the whole regulatory process so that it's not just rate cases are not something that are just decided in front of a law judge, an administrative law judge. It's something that people can actually participate in. And so I'll be hopeful that'll make some of those changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to have to just do one more question, and I know, Bob, you're going to keep it short and to the point.
Thanks.
My question is about the workforce that will make adjustment to the existing buildings.
Yep.
Are you working with BOCES or comparable programs in other states so that within 5 or 10 years we have the people that know how to do these changes?
It's a great question. So one of the things that I didn't mention that we're doing with Push Buffalo is they're actually building their own workforce training center that will be coming online later this year. And so through that, we're actually doing training of architecture students in passive house principles, but also how to do residential weatherization. So these are graduate students. But then the goal is to have them actually being trainers at the Push Workforce Training Center, so that we are having someone can go anywhere from a GED to a PhD in these kinds of topics. But also, you know, in building citizen architects, really important that people are engaged in the communities and understand, you know, how sustainability, how livability, how resilience are framed in communities that they don't necessarily belong to, so that they can be much more effective and work on that in the future. So I'm with you 100%.
Bob, that